This recording was brought to you by King's Church Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz.
We have been doing a series. We've been going through a series as a church called Living the Dream, focusing on the life of the biblical character Joseph at the end of Genesis, the last few chapters. And if you'll remember, the first week we looked at the dreamer and we were encouraged to dream. And last week we looked at the moment when the brothers turn on Joseph and they throw him in the pit. And we dealt with how do you work through those moments when you find yourself in a pit in life, not knowing how to move forward, not knowing how the dream relates to the pit. But also we were reminded that actually in that story we are the brothers, and Jesus is the marvellous Holy One who comes and brings salvation to us. Now we get to chapter 38 of Genesis, and for those of you who know your Bibles, you will know that at this moment the narrative story of Joseph is left on a massive cliffhanger. I don't know whether you watch TV programs which leave you on a massive cliffhanger. I watched a program recently called Line of Duty, and there was the bad guy and the goodie who happened to be a female officer standing there at the end of a show pointing their guns at each other, and they were going, "Stop, put your gun down," and then it went blank and there were two shots. And here we find this moment where it's like the screen has gone blank. Joseph has been sold into slavery in Egypt. The hero of our has been sold into slavery in Egypt. And we want to know what happens next. Well, like all good cliffhangers, quite often it takes you in another direction. And the writer of Genesis takes us to a completely different place and starts telling us this story about one of the brothers, Judah and Tamar. Now, you will remember Judah. He is the brother who has, rather than murder his younger sibling, has decided actually we'd get more profit from it if we sold him. So he's a bit of an unscrupulous character. And if you've come here this morning wanting to have a nice usual 3-point sermon, you might find yourself being a bit shocked by this story. It's a little bit more like, rather than a 3-point sermon, it's a little bit more this story like Game of Thrones meets The Godfather. Now, and I'm not recommending either of those shows to anyone. Please don't start watching, certainly not Game of Thrones. But this is what this story is like. And if you're kind of one of our TKYers here, there's going to be elements of this story that you might think, what on earth is that doing in the Bible? If you're an adult here, you might be thinking, what on earth is some of this content doing in the Bible? I just really encourage you to talk about it with your folks afterwards, maybe talk about it with a mature person in the church afterwards. But this is the Word of God. So we're going to read the next part of the narrative. It will come up behind me on the screen so you can follow along. About this time, Judah left home and moved to Adullam, where he stayed with a man named Hira. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. When he slept with her, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and he named the boy Then she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, and she named him Onan. And when she gave birth to a third son, she named him Shelah. At the time of Shelah's birth, they were living at Chezib. In the course of time, Judah arranged for his firstborn son to marry a young woman named Tamar. But was a wicked man in the Lord's sight, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to brother Onan, "Go marry Tamar, as our law requires of the brother of a man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother." But Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground. This prevented him from having a child who would belong to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child to his dead brother, so the Lord took Onan's life too. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you." But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his two brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. Some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hirah the Adullamite went up to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Someone told Tamar, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangements had been made for her to come and marry him. So she changed out of her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat beside the road at the entrance to the village of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Judah noticed her and thought she was a prostitute, since she had covered her face. So he stopped and propositioned her. "Let me have sex with you," he said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. "How much will you pay to have sex with me?" Tamar asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," Judah promised. "But what will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat?" she asked. "What kind of guarantee do you want?" he replied. She answered, "Leave me your identification seal and its cord and the walking stick you are carrying." So Judah gave them to her. Then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Afterwards, she went back home, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothing as usual. Later, Judah asked his friend Hirah the Adullamite to take the young goat to the woman and to pick up the things he had given her as his guarantee. But Hirah couldn't find her, so he asked the men who lived there, "Where can I find the shrine prostitute who was sitting beside the road at the entrance to Enaim?" "We've never had a shrine prostitute here," they replied. So Hirah returned to Judah and told him, "I couldn't find her anywhere, and the men of the village claim they've never had a shrine prostitute there." "Then let her keep the things I gave her," Judah said. "I sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'd be a laughingstock of the village if we went back again to look for her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute, and now because of this she's pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burned," Judah demanded. But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "The man who owns these things made me pregnant. Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these?" Judah recognized them immediately and said, "She is more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Shelah." And Judah never slept with Tamar again. When the time came for Tamar to give birth, it was discovered that she was carrying twins. While she was in labor, one of the babies reached out its hand. The midwife grabbed it and tied a scarlet string around the child's wrist, announcing, "This one came out first." But then he pulled his hand back, and out came his brother. "What?" the midwife exclaimed. "How did you break out first?" So he was named Perez, which means breach. Then the baby with the scarlet string on his wrist was born, and he was named Zerah. This is God's word. Have you ever seen the movie Jurassic Park? Okay, many people would have watched the movie Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is a story about dinosaurs that are brought back to life and end up eating and killing most of the human beings that are on the island with them. On a day not unlike this, the big storm comes in and causes all these problems for the people in the story. And if you've ever read the book of Jurassic Park, it's clear that there is a very clear point to what the writer is saying. It's not so clear in the movie, but there is one moment when a group of scientists are sat together and the theoretical mathematician says, "Look, the problem with this island is you were so excited about what you could do that you never stopped to think whether you should do it." You see, Jurassic Park isn't really about dinosaurs eating human beings. It's about the ethics of genetic engineering. Now, I'm not saying that the writer of Genesis is talking about genetic engineering, but he is doing something here which points to something and also compares something. So if you read this chapter, you constantly see a spiral of the behavior of Judah going down and down, consistently making bad choices and going down and down and down. And at the end, salvation comes to him. Now, if you compare that to the next chapter, as we will find out next week, you consistently see Joseph making good moral decisions, which you would think would elevate him, but then he ends up in prison. What an incredible thing that is that the writer's doing here. It also prepares us for later on in the story, for the part that Judah will play later on in the story. So what I'm going to do today in this quite intense chapter is I'm going to treat it a little bit like a book, and I'm going to go through it in chapters. Like I've separated it out into my own little chapters, and we're just going to look at the things that go on. We're going to try and understand it a bit more, and then we're going to try and apply some of the characters' situations to our own lives. So first, in chapter 1, we see Judah separating from his family. I don't know whether you've ever noticed this in your own life or whether you've seen it in other people's, but there are times when you do something which is wrong. And Judah was like that. He just caused his brother to be sold into slavery. Maybe he couldn't deal with the pain that he saw in his father. Maybe he was just running away from it. But he separates from his family, the ones who would maybe hold him accountable, the ones who he could grieve with for this son, the Joseph, who's been sold. They've lied to their father and told him that Joseph is dead, and he separates. He wanders off. He gets mixed up with someone who, and it doesn't explicitly say in the text that this friend Hera is a bad guy, but he always seems to crop up when bad things are starting to go on. And we see him here making friends with this character who doesn't seem to do him much good. In fact, he ends up living in a city called Hezeb. Now, if you were to look at the text and translate it, Hezeb means the place of lies. That is the name of the city that he ends up living in. Or deception, the place of lies or deception. That was the name that was given to that city that he was living in. And he has 3 sons. Now, this could be a really confusing moment in the story. This whole situation where this lady, Tamar, is being offered around to the 3 sons. I just want to do a little bit of an explanation as to what is going on here. It's a thing called levirate marriage law, and it was very prevalent in that day. It still exists in some parts of the world today, but I need 3 stooges to help me with this. Now, I told the 3 stooges who they were before, so Sam, Josh, and Paul Williams, please come and stand over here. My 3 stooges. Right. All right, if you just stand in the line here, please. You are the 3 sons of Judah. So, Sam, if you can stand first in the line. You are Please put the beard on. Thank you. Paul, if you come and stand here. You are Onan. Please put the beard on. And Josh, you are, what's the youngest son's name? Sheila. You are the youngest son, so you can't grow a beard yet, so you don't have a beard. Okay? Now, what we see is Judah finds a wife for And there's another really unusual thing in the text. You remember I say in Genesis, often you don't see the Bible or the writer of Genesis saying, this person did this and it was bad, this person did this and it was bad. You just see this happened and then this happened and this happened. Well, in this situation, it's really unusual because we don't find out what did. It just said, God thought he was evil, and so he killed him. So you can die. Off you go, Sam. But you see, the problem for Tamar, this wife that Judah had found, was that in losing her husband and not having an heir, not having a child yet, it meant that she would have no one who would look after her in the future. Because what would also happen, sorry, I completely forgot to do this with you, Sam, is that the posterity of the family would need to be preserved. And what would normally happen when there were three sons was that all of the sheep, all of the land, I've got dollar signs here, would be split up between the sons when the father died. Now, Sam's not here, but what would happen would be you would have this portion, but the oldest surviving son would receive a double portion, okay? So initially you'd have had Sam standing here with a double portion, Onan with a single, Shelah with a single portion. But has died. And so what happens here is Judah says, right, you must take Tamar as your wife. But if Tamar produces an heir, it's not Onan's, it belongs to So the double portion would go to that son. And Onan doesn't like this. And so he takes everything he wants from the relationship and gives nothing to Tamar. He essentially abuses her sexually. He doesn't give her the thing that she needs that's going to protect her and is going to see her be able to carry on and live a life which would be looked after. Whereas at the moment, she's in a terrible situation of not having that. God sees Onan as evil for doing that. And so, Onan dies. Thank you. Thank you, Onan. He's really owning the part. Thank you. And of course, this leaves the youngster, but he's not old enough, because he hasn't got a beard yet, to marry. So Tamar is sent away back home in widow's clothes. And this young fella is left to grow up with the promise that he will eventually have Tamar, will be able to produce an heir and see not only the bloodline of the family, but also all of the money, the sheep, the land would be continued and the family would continue on. Thank you very much. Well done. And that's how levirate marriage works. It might be somewhat distasteful to us in our Western culture, but it is what happened, and it happens as well today in some parts of the world. Clothing's really important in this part of the Bible. We see Joseph being given a robe which signalled him out as the boss, if you like, the foreman of the family. He was given high position in the family, and Tamar is sent away back to her parents, and she has to wear the clothes of a widow, which means it signals to everyone she's someone else's, and it was obvious that she hadn't had an heir, so she was left essentially to go and lay down and die in her father's house. What a horrendous position to be in. You have no hope for the future. You're just left to go and die in your father's house. Chapter 2. Judah goes sheep shearing, I've entitled this. Now, his wife has died. Judah's wife has died. He doesn't intend to give Tamar to the youngest son because of superstition rather than anything else. He thinks, well, if I give him to her, she's like a curse. My youngest son might die, so I don't intend to do that, even though that was his responsibility. Again, we see this spiral of Judah's behavior. He's neglecting his responsibilities continuously. And in this situation, he's mourned his wife and he's going sheep shearing. Now, going sheep shearing in that moment would have involved shearing sheep, but it would have also involved getting very drunk, possibly sleeping with women and having sex with women. That was kind of, it's not so much a euphemism because they actually did go and shear sheep, but that was what you did when you went sheep shearing at that part of the world at that time. And here's something remarkable starts to happen. Tamar hears that Judah is going off sheep shearing. She realizes that she's not going to get what is hers in terms of she has been pledged to this family. And so she takes matters into her own hands. She doesn't lie down and die. though she's been abused by this family and used by this family, she does something remarkable. She takes off this sign of identity, her widow's clothes. She disguises herself. And what she essentially does is go and make Judah take his responsibility literally and seriously. For you see, if all the sons die, it's Judah's responsibility to her to provide an heir. And she gets into this dialogue with him. Can I have sex with you? Yes, you can, but you must pay me. How will I know you're going to pay me? And they get to this point where she says, give me your seal, which would have been a proof of purchase, but also your staff, which would have been, everyone would have recognized the staff of this patriarch of the family. It was like his identity would have been known by the staff, a sign of authority, perhaps. And what she asked him to do is, in modern parlance, essentially to give him her credit cards and driver's license. Here's the thing that's going to prove that you're going to pay for something, and here's the thing that's going to prove what your identity is. And she goes away. Chapter 3, I call this the unraveling. Judah tries to put the debt right. He tries to send the goat, which would then mean that the signs of his identity would be given back to him. But there's no shrine prostitute there. And here he has a chance to put things right. He has a chance to pursue and give that back. But again, he neglects his responsibility. And why? Because he's concerned about what his reputation would look like. He's concerned about saving face. What will the people think of us, of me, if we go back and we offer these things and there's no one there? Who have I slept with? The unraveling. Chapter 4, the end of the road. We get to this moment where Tamar is starting to show. The babies that have been produced in her through Judah, the pregnancy is starting to be obvious to everyone, and that's told to Judah. Your daughter-in-law has behaved like a prostitute, as the text says. And Judah's response is pretty awful. It says in here that it says, bring her out and burn her. Actually, if you look at the Hebrew text, what he actually says is, bring, burn. There's nothing in between. Bring, burn. It's violent. It's judgmental. It's harsh. There's no grace in there whatsoever. He's so concerned with how it looks to his family. He might even be thinking, actually, this helps me to get out of this responsibility I had towards this woman. Bring, burn. And as they're bringing out, Tamar again very bravely says, show these to Judah and say, the person who made me pregnant, these belong to him. And the seal and the staff are produced. And can you imagine that scene? Probably all the people are sitting around because everyone loves a good public lynching, and they're all getting ready to go. And then this dramatic moment as the person who made her pregnant, these signs of the identity are produced. And if they didn't recognize the seal, they would have certainly recognized the staff. And Judah, at this moment, has another situation where he can either choose to take hold of responsibility or he can continue his spiral down. And what we see is this amazing moment where the extraordinary sovereign grace of God is revealed. Because rather than take the easy route, perhaps, where he would just dispose of Tamar, he comes to a moment where he declares, he sees that he has done wrong. He realizes it and he says it publicly. She is more righteous than me. And at that moment, he starts to put things right. The amazing mercy and grace of God, which gives us opportunities, even though we so often neglect our responsibilities and we spiral down and walk away from the things that God would have us. There are moments, and God makes them available to us, where we can say, I'm wrong. Please forgive me. I need to put this right. Finally, chapter 5, the odd epilogue. Because we have this strange story at the end of the babies being born. And are there any midwives in the house? Because, what would it be like to have that moment when a baby's hand pops out of the womb? You tie a ribbon around it, and then the hand pulls back, and another baby pushes out past. Al, I would imagine that the skill of the midwife to be able to deliver a baby without serious injury to the children or to the mother is incredible. But we have this amazing moment, and the baby that pushes past is called Perez, which means breach. Now, what's the writer doing here? Why on earth do we see this little thing, this little bit at the end of the story, this strange story of a strange birth? Well, it signals to us in the narrative that what's coming next is possibly more extraordinary than we could have ever imagined. That the younger son, who has just been sold into slavery, actually ultimately will prevail. But it also speaks to us that God does things in ways that often we would never expect, that we would never anticipate. Would you anticipate that a virgin would give birth in Bethlehem and that child would be God incarnate? See, God is a God who breaches through our understanding. That baby, God, or the fullness of God dwelling in that baby, would grow up and live a perfect life, fulfilling all of the law that is written down in the Bible, and would be crucified innocently, would be slaughtered innocently, a bit like the goats that we see in the stories here. That he would be put in a tomb and would be considered dead for 3 days, but would rise from the dead. That the stone of the tomb would be rolled away, that he would burst through, and that glorious day would be opened up for all the peoples of the world if they believe in him. That he would ascend into heaven and be alive and living and here with us this morning. God does things in ways that we could never imagine. You see, alongside this story is the very real truth. As you read in Matthew, it's not the line of Joseph which is spoken about. As you get to the book of Revelation and all things are being wrapped up and the Son of God is revealed, they don't say, "Behold, the Lamb of Joseph." They say, "Behold, the Lion." Sorry. Behold, the Lion of Judah. God works in ways that we would never conceive of doing it. It's not the way we would do it. But God does amazing things and miraculous things. Have you had a dream? Do you long for things in your life and you think, I have seen no way of that happening? Are you a bit like Judah, perhaps, who has made bad choices and has been maybe led astray and has spiraled down and down and down? Leslie, could you just come up and start playing Waymaker? Are you like Judah? Do you identify with Judah? Have you made mistakes and you spiral down and down and down? You know, if that is you this morning, if you're listening because you can't get here this morning because of the storm outside or overseas or wherever you are listening to this, are you a bit like Judah? Because the wonderful thing about the mercy of God is that there is time now to come home, to be reunited with family, to put yourself in a place where you can grow and that the plans and purposes of God will still be seen in your life. Do you identify perhaps with Onan, where you have this wonderful opportunity to continue the heritage of your family that's been before? Maybe you've been in a Christian family and you've walked away from that, or you're considering walking away and spoiling all of that heritage that you have for selfish reasons. You know, you can come home. You can build again. Or are you in this story like Tamar, and you've been abused and mistreated? And I just want to be really careful with this, because if that is your situation and you want to respond, I just want to encourage you just to do that quietly and privately with someone in the week, maybe someone you trust, someone who can work this through. The thing about Tamar is she didn't lie down and die because of the things that had been done to her. She took responsibility where others around her refused to take responsibility for her. She took responsibility for herself, and she stood up. She changed the clothing of a widow, and she made Judah take responsibility that he should have done for her. Can we just stand together?
This video recording is brought to you by King's Church, Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz